Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little trip. Not to a beach, not to the mountains, but to a place in time. We're heading back to 14th century Europe, right before things get, well, complicated. Our mission is to understand a very dark chapter of human history, but from the inside out. And a fair warning, if this were a real-time machine, your 21st century immune system and modern sensibilities might mean you wouldn't last the first day. The smells alone. We'll get to that. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little community of night owls spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The journey doesn't begin with a grand vista or a royal proclamation. It begins with a sound. It's the deep, resonant clang of a church bell, rolling across the fields and pulling you toward the high stone walls on the horizon. This is your destination. A city, not a metropolis of glass and steel, but a tight, walled-in organism of timber, stone, and humanity. As you approach the city gate, guarded by a couple of bored-looking men at arms leaning on their pikes, the second thing hits you, the smell. It's a thick, earthy cocktail of wood smoke, baking bread, livestock, damp wool, unwashed bodies, and something vaguely like old cabbage. It's the smell of life, unfiltered and concentrated. You pay the small gate toll a coin for the city coffers and step from the relative openness of the road into the city proper. The world immediately shrinks. The streets are narrow, more like winding canyons between leaning, timber-framed houses. The upper floors jut out over the street, almost close enough for neighbors to shake hands from their windows. They blot out the sky, leaving the lane below. In a perpetual twilight, you look down, and you understand the need for sturdy boots. The street isn't paved. It's a packed, earth mess of mud, animal droppings, and household waste. A central gutter, more of a shallow ditch, carries a sluggish, unidentifiable stream of liquid. You have to sidestep a large pig, who is nonchalantly rooting through a pile of discarded vegetable peels next to a doorway. These weren't just feral animals. In many medieval towns, pigs were the city's unofficial and very bristly sanitation department, allowed to roam and eat the garbage. It's a strange, but efficient, kind of recycling. But this isn't chaos. Not entirely. You start to notice the order within the jumble. Above almost every ground floor workshop hangs a painted wooden sign, a visual language for a largely illiterate population. A pretzel for the baker, a boot for the cobbler, a pair of shears for the weaver. This is the world of the guilds, powerful fraternities that controlled every aspect of a trade, from the quality of the goods to the price, to who was even allowed to practice the craft. They were the backbone of the city's economy and its social structure. The city is a symphony of noise. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer rings out, a rhythmic counterpoint to the rumble of a wooden cart being dragged over the uneven ground. You hear the shouts of merchants hawking their wares, the laughter of children chasing a stray dog, the murmur of a friar in a brown robe preaching to a small crowd on a corner, and over it all, every quarter hour, the church bells ring out again, marking the passage of time, calling the faithful to prayer, and reminding everyone who is truly in charge of the rhythm of their lives. As you carefully pick your way across the mucky lane, you might wonder if these people were simply accustomed to living in filth. And that's a point that historians still actively debate. On one hand, the visual and olfactory evidence points to a reality of relentless squalor where disease would seem inevitable. Yet, surviving city records from the period are often full of surprisingly detailed sanitation ordinances. There were rules against dumping waste directly into the main river, fines for butchers who left animal parts in the street, and regulations about where and when you could dispose of your household slop. The truth, as it often is, was likely a messy compromise between rule and reality. They had ideas about civic hygiene, but the infrastructure and enforcement were, let's say, inconsistent at best. You are a stranger here, an outsider. Your clothes are different. Your accent, if you were to speak, would be foreign. People glance at you with curiosity, some with suspicion. In a world where most people lived and died within 20 miles of where they were born, a strange face was an event. You realize the city wall isn't just a physical defense against invading armies. It's a psychological and social barrier. Inside, you belong to a parish, a guild, a neighborhood. Outside, you are nobody. Your journey has just begun, and the first task is simple survival, finding a place to eat, a bed for the night, and a way to understand the complex, unwritten rules of this crowded, noisy, and vibrant world. You duck into a tavern, the sign above showing a foaming tankard of ale, and the relative darkness inside is a relief from the sensory assault of the street. The real story starts here. The tavern is a effigy of smoke, sweat, and spilled ale. Its slow, beamed ceiling is stained black from years of candle and hearth fire. At a rough-hewn wooden table, a group of bowmen are loudly playing a game with dice, slamming their leather cups down with each throw. In the corner, a merchant, identifiable by his slightly finer, if still practical, woolen cloak, is quietly negotiating something with a man whose face is half hidden by shadow. You order a small ale that's safer than the water, and the innkeeper, a heavy-set woman with shrewd eyes, sizes you up in an instant. Your forensics is a commodity here. That means you need things, and she has them to sell. At a price, you nurse your drink, listening to the fragments of conversation. It's a mix of local gossip, complaints about the price of grain, and a colorful story about a cheating miller. You're trying to figure out where a person on a tight budget might find lodging. When the innkeeper comes by to wipe down your table with a damp, sour-smelling rag, you ask her. She gives you a look that's half pity, half business. The inns on the main square are for merchants with coin, she says, her voice raspy. You'll want a room down by the south gate, on Rose Lane. She says the name with a slight, knowing smirk. You can't miss it. Following her directions, you leave the relative warmth of the tavern and head back into the chilly evening air. The route takes you away from the central market square, toward the city's outer wall. The character of the streets begins to change. The workshops of the artisans give way to more taverns, cookshops selling greasy meat pies, and buildings that seem a little more ramshackle. The noise here is different, too, less the productive clang of industry, more the boisterous shouts and laughter of men at leisure. And then you find it, Rose Lane. The name is a quaint, almost comical euphemism. It's a narrow street, but surprisingly well lit with lanterns hanging from iron brackets, a sign that this area is under some kind of official purview. And here, standing in doorways or leaning from windows, are women. They call out to the men walking by, their voices a mix of invitation and practice banter. This is the city's designated zone of tolerance. It's official, managed red light district. In our modern minds, we imagine such things hidden in the darkest, most dangerous corners of a city. But here, it's an open secret, a recognized part of the urban landscape. This wasn't seen as a sign of moral decay, but as a pragmatic necessity. The prevailing logic, heavily influenced by the writings of church fathers like Street, Augustine, was that male lust was an uncontrollable force. If you didn't provide a designated channel for it, it would spill over and defile honorable women, the wives and daughters of the citizenry, in a grimly functional metaphor. These districts were seen as the city's sewer system, unpleasant, but vital for carrying away filth and keeping the rest of the city clean. This was the city's necessary evil. You notice something peculiar. Many of the women here wear a specific, identifying article of clothing. In this city, it seems to be a yellow ribbon tied around their arm or pinned to their dress. It's a small but powerful symbol. This was a common and very specific regulation in many medieval towns. In some places, it was a striped hood. In others, a particular style of cloak. It served a dual purpose. It publicly marked these women, separating them from the respectable female population and preventing any man from claiming he was an unwitting customer. But it also, in a strange way, offered them a sliver of official identity. They were operating within a known, albeit marginalized, system. The very existence of such a regulated system is a topic that still sparks debate among historians. Was this really about protecting public order and the virtue of good women, or was it primarily an economic enterprise? City records from across Europe show that municipalities didn't just tolerate this trade. They actively profited from it. They licensed the brothels, known as stews or stew houses, and levied taxes on the women and their keepers. In some cities, like Nuremberg or Amiens, the town council itself owned and operated the official municipal brothel, appointing a manager and setting the rules. So, was this social engineering or just a very cynical business model? The answer is likely an uncomfortable mix of both. As you walk the length of Rose Lane, you see the spectrum of humanity that this life entailed. Some women look no older than girls, their faces etched with a hardness that belies their years. Others are older, their bodies showing the wear of a difficult life. They are not a faceless monolith of sinners. They are individuals, each with a story that led them to this street corner famine in their home village, the death of a husband, the lack of a dowry, or perhaps being an outsider with no guild or family to protect them. Their status was one of profound contradiction. They were simultaneously essential and despised, protected and exploited, visible and yet socially invisible. They were part of the city's recognized order, yet they were forbidden from touching the bread at the baker's stall for fear they would contaminate it. They were a living, breathing paradox, sanctioned by the very authorities who would publicly condemn their existence. You find a cheap guest house at the end of the lane, the last building before the stone of the city wall. The room is tiny, just a straw mattress on a wooden frame. Through the thin walls, you can hear the sounds of Rose Lane, a world sanctioned by law, yet condemned by faith. The next morning, the sound of the Matins bell from the nearby cathedral pulls you from a fitful sleep. You step outside, and the city is already awake, a hive of activity. You decide to head towards the source of the bells, the heart of the city's spiritual life. The cathedral is an awe-inspiring sight, a stone behemoth that towers over every other building. Its spires seem to scratch the sky, a testament to the decades, sometimes centuries, of labor it took to build. It's a physical manifestation of God's power on earth, designed to make you feel small, to make you feel humble. You slip inside. The air is cool and smells of incense and old stone. Sunlight streams through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in jewel tones of ruby, sapphire, and emerald. The windows aren't just for decoration. They are the Bible for the illiterate. They tell the stories of saints, of Adam and Eve's fall from grace, of the Last Judgment with its graphic depictions of the damned being tormented for their sins. A mass is underway. At the high altar, a priest in ornate vestments chants in Latin, a language you and most of the congregation don't understand, but you don't need to. The power is in the ritual, the mystery, the shared experience of being in this sacred space. This is the church with a capital C, the single most powerful institution in your world. It guides your life from baptism to burial, dictates the holidays, owns vast tracts of land, and holds the keys to eternal salvation. Its moral authority is, in theory, absolute, and that authority is clear on the matter of the women on Rose Lane. In the eyes of the church, their trade is a grave sin. They are vessels of lust, daughters of Eve, temptations leading men away from the path of righteousness. The sermons you hear, the art you see, all reinforce this message. Lust is one of the 7 deadly sins, and they are its most visible practitioners. You might see a carving on a column depicting a demon whispering into the ear of a finely dressed woman, or a painting of a hellmouth swallowing up those who succumb to carnal pleasures. The message is unambiguous. Yet, as you leave the cathedral and walk back toward the commercial heart of the city, you begin to see the cracks in this absolute moral stance. You pass a man in a long robe, carrying a ledger. He is not a priest, but a clerk working for the bishop's administration. He is making his rounds, collecting dues and rents. And here is where the city's spiritual and earthly economies collide. You learn through hushed conversations and simple observation that the very same church that condemns the women of Rose Lane in its sermons is often, directly or indirectly, their landlord. In many cities, the land on which the brothels were built was owned by the local bishopric, or a powerful monastery. They leased the properties to the brothel keepers, collecting a steady, reliable rent. It was a practice so common in some parts of Europe that the rents from these establishments had their own line item in the ecclesiastical account books. In London, for instance, the brothels in the district of Southwark were located on land owned by the Bishop of Winchester, and the women who worked there were known colloquially as Winchester geese. This wasn't a hidden, shameful secret. It was an accepted part of the urban economy. This leads to a fascinating and deeply hypocritical set of rules. For example, while the church would take their rent money all year, these women were often forbidden from entering the main body of a church. They could not be buried in consecrated ground alongside decent folk. They had their own separate graveyards, often in unhallowed, out-of-the-way plots. They were, in essence, sinners whose money was clean, but whose bodies were not. And then there was the sin tax. In addition to rent, some church authorities levied a direct tax on the women's earnings. The justification was a masterpiece of theological acrobatics. It was framed as a form of penance. The money they earned through sin could be cleansed by giving a portion of it to the church, which would then use it for good works alms for the poor, upkeep for the cathedral, funding for a new chapel. It was a spiritual laundry service. You could sin, pay the fee, and be granted a degree of absolution, allowing the cycle to continue. Historians still puzzle over the exact mental gymnastics required to maintain this system. How did a bishop reconcile his sacred duty to save souls with his financial interest in the continuation of sin? Some scholars argue it was pure, unadulterated cynicism, a way for a wealthy and powerful institution to become even wealthier. Others suggest a more complex, paternalistic view, that church leaders saw it as a way to control and contain an inevitable sin, using the profits to fund the very institution that could offer salvation from it. The truth is probably somewhere in the murky middle. It was a system born of a strange marriage between high-minded theology and cold, hard cash. As you stand in the market square, you watch the bishop's clerk stop to talk to a wealthy-looking merchant. A few minutes later, you see him heading in the direction of Rose Lane. He doesn't look ashamed or secretive. HES just doing his job. The church bells ring out again, marking midday. The sound echoes over the righteous and the sinner, the tax collector and the tax, all bound together in a complex web of faith, commerce, and profound contradiction. The very foundation of the city's moral order, you realize, is built on a very convenient and profitable double standard. You decide to spend the day observing, trying to understand the rhythm of life for the women you saw last night on Rose Lane. The daylight washes away the lantern-lit mystique and reveals a much more mundane reality. The lane is quieter now, but not deserted. Life here doesn't just happen after dark. You see a woman, perhaps one of the faces from last night, sitting on the steps of her building, mending a tear in a simple linen dress. Her hands are chapped, her knuckles red from the cold morning air. She isn't wearing the yellow ribbon from the night before. That's for business hours. In the light of day, she could be any other working woman in the city, a spinner, a laundress, a baker's wife. She chats with a neighbor who is sweeping her doorstep, their conversation punctuated by easy laughter. It's a small, human moment that cuts through the labels and stereotypes. A little further down the street, two women are haggling with a street vendor over the price of a few scraggly-looking carrots. They argue with the same ferocity as the respectable housewives in the main market, trying to stretch their meager earnings to cover the day's food. You realize that their income, earned in the most intimate and dangerous way, is spent on the most ordinary things: bread, ale, firewood, a bit of ribbon for their hair. This glimpse into their daily lives shatters the simplistic image of them as mere vessels of sin. They were, first and foremost, poor working women, part of the city's vast, struggling underclass. Their profession was just one of many desperate strategies for survival in a world with few safety nets. A historical tidbit that's often overlooked is that many of these women were not full-time, lifelong prostitutes. Their work was often seasonal or temporary. A woman might turn to this trade for a few months during a harsh winter when other work was scarce. or to save up a small dowry in the hopes of eventually getting married. Some were widows with children to feed, left destitute after their husband's death. Their lives were fluid, and they moved in and out of the trade as their circumstances changed. You also start to notice the internal hierarchy of their world. Not all women on Rose Lane are equal. There are the women who work in the official, city-licensed brothels, the stew houses. These establishments were often run by a formidable matriarch, a Madame or Bod, who provided food, lodging, and a degree of protection in exchange for a huge cut of their earnings. The women here had a slightly higher status. They were part of a recognized, if maligned, business. Then there were the independent operators, women who rented their own rooms and worked for themselves. They kept more of their earnings, but were also more vulnerable, lacking the protection of a powerful keeper. And at the very bottom of the ladder were the most desperate. The street walkers who had no fixed abode were at the mercy of both violent clients and abusive city guards. Their lives were the most precarious of all. You witness a brief, sharp argument between two women on a street corner. It seems to be a dispute over a particular spot, a prime location for attracting customers. It's a stark reminder that they were not a sisterhood, but competitors in a crowded and difficult market. They had their own codes, their own territories, and their own conflicts. One of the most fascinating, undebated aspects of their lives is their relationship with the law. While they were regulated and taxed, they also had, in some places, surprising legal recourse. Surviving court records from the period show cases where these women successfully sued clients who refused to pay or who were violent. For example, a man who assaulted a registered prostitute could, in theory, be fined or punished, not because he harmed her as a person, but because he had damaged the property of the brothel keeper or deprived the city of its rightful tax revenue. It was a strange, dehumanizing form of justice, but it was justice nonetheless. It affirmed their status as a legitimate, if lowly, part of the city's economic machinery. Historians still analyze these court documents to understand the complex legal and social standing of these women. Were they victims, entrepreneurs, or a unique category all their own? Later in the afternoon, you see a woman walking with a small child, holding his hand as they navigate the muddy street. It's a jolting sight. We tend to think of these women as solitary figures, but many had families. They were mothers, sisters, and daughters. The presence of the child raises a host of heartbreaking questions. Is he her son? Will he grow up in this environment? What future does the city hold for him? This small domestic scene is a powerful testament to the complexity of their existence. They were not defined solely by their trade. They lived, they loved, they cared for their families. They worried about the future, just like anyone else. As dusk begins to fall, the lanterns on Rose Lane are lit once more. The mending is put away. The day's marketing is done. The women retreat into their doorways, and the yellow ribbons reappear. The transformation begins again. But now, when you look at them, you don't just see the sinners from the priest's sermon or the necessary evil from the city council's ledger. You see the woman who was mending her dress, the women who were arguing over carrots, the mother holding her child's hand. You see the human beings behind the label, caught in a system that both sustained and condemned them, their lives. You realize we're far more complicated than any simple category could ever capture. Life in the city settles into a predictable, if grimy, routine. You learn the best times to go to the market, which baker sells bread that isn't half sawdust, and which streets to avoid after dark. The city is an island of relative stability in a world that is often anything but. You hear travelers in the tavern speak of famines in the countryside, of petty wars between feudal lords, of banditry on the king's highways. But within the stone walls, the rhythm of the guilds and the church bells provides a comforting sense of order. The first whispers arrive, as they so often do, at the docks. The city is not on the sea, but it's connected by a wide, navigable river that brings goods and people from the great port cities of the South. Genoa, Venice, Marseille. It's the city's lifeline, its artery to the wider world. And one day, a merchant ship dies up, its crew looking haggard and unusually subdued. In the taverns that night, the sailors talk. They speak of a sickness, a terrifying, unstoppable pestilence that is sweeping through the port cities of the Mediterranean. They use vague, fearful words. They talk of sudden fevers, of black swellings in the groin and armpits, of death that comes in a matter of days. They say it started far away, in the east. Some say it came from Cathay, carried along the Silk Road. Others blame the Tartars, who were said to have used catapults to hurl the bodies of their own plague dead soldiers over the walls of a besieged Janos trading post in the Crimea. Most people who hear these stories dismiss them. It's sailors' talk, the kind of exaggerated yarn spun over cheap ale to impress the landlubbers. Sickness is a part of life. There's the ague, the flux, the sweating sickness. Every few years, an outbreak of something unpleasant sweeps through a neighborhood, especially in the poorer, more crowded quarters. It's tragic, but it's familiar. It's part of God's plan, a test of faith. These stories from the South sound like something else entirely, something biblical, apocalyptic. It's too fantastic to be real. A few weeks later, another ship arrives. This time, the news is more concrete, harder to dismiss. The sailors speak of entire cities being hollowed out. They name names: Florence, Siena, Pisa. They say the dead are being buried in mass graves, piled in trenches like layers of lasagna with dirt. The phrase makes you shudder. The imagery is too specific, too grotesque to be a simple sailor's tale. The whispers start to spread from the taverns and docks into the market square, into the workshops of the artisans. A weaver, pausing at his loom, might ask a customer if they've heard the news from Italy. The baker, dusting flour from his hands, might share a rumor he heard from a spice merchant. The stories become a low, anxious hum beneath the daily noise of the city. The city's authorities, the mayor and the council of wealthy merchants, are aware of the rumors. Of course, they are practical men, concerned with trade, taxes, and maintaining order. A panic is bad for business. They issue a public statement, read by a herald in the main square. They assure the citizenry that the city is safe, protected by God's favor and its own sturdy walls. They may quietly order the guards at the gate to be a little more discerning about who they let in, perhaps turning away travelers who look ill or destitute. But they do nothing more. What could they do? The enemy is a rumor, an invisible me as much from a faraway land. Even the church is slow to react. A local priest might mention the sufferings of their Christian brothers in the South in a sermon, calling for prayers. But the official theological position is that such a pestilence, if it is real, is a divine judgment upon the sins of those distant cities. They must have been exceptionally wicked places to warrant such a terrible punishment. The implicit message is one of reassurance. We are not like them. We are righteous. God would not punish us in such a way. The historical debate here centers on just how much information people truly had. In an age without mass media, how did news travel, and how was it interpreted? Some historians argue that news of the plague spread was surprisingly fast and accurate, moving along established trade routes. They point to letters between merchants in different cities that discuss the great mortality with a chilling sense of its approach. Others argue that information was slow, fragmented, and distorted by rumor and superstition. For most ordinary people, the plague wouldn't have been a creeping, predictable wave, but a terrifying mystery that seemed to appear out of nowhere. You find yourself looking at your fellow citizens differently. You watch a man cough in the street, and a flicker of unease runs through you. You see a ship being unloaded at the wharf, and you wonder what invisible cargo it carries besides wine and wool. The city still looks the same. The bells still ring on the hour. The women on Rose Lane still ply their trade. But something has shifted. A seed of fear has been planted. It's a tiny seed, buried under layers of daily routine, official denial, and religious faith. But it's there, waiting for the first rain of real, undeniable terror to make it grow. The blue sky above seems as clear as ever. But for the first time, you feel as though you're living in a city holding its breath, waiting for a storm that no one can see. The storm breaks on a mild Tuesday in late spring. It doesn't arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic announcement. It begins with a man you vaguely recognize, a wool carter who lives in a cramped tenement just a few streets over from your lodging. You saw him just a few days ago, arguing good-naturedly with a merchant in the market. Now, you see his wife, her face a mask of panic, running down the street towards the house of a local barber surgeon. Later that day, the whispers are no longer about faraway cities. They are about your neighbor. The Wilkire, people say, was struck down by a sudden, violent fever. He was shivering uncontrollably, yet his skin was hot to the touch. He complained of a blinding headache and a terrible thirst. And then the lump appeared, a hard, painful swelling, the size of a small apple, in his groin. The word used to describe it, whispered in hushed, tearful tones, is buba. It's a word most people have never heard before, but it will soon become the most feared word in their vocabulary. The city's delicate membrane of denial ruptures. The abstract fear that has been a low hum in the background for weeks becomes a loud, screaming reality. This is not a story from a sailor. This is not a divine judgment on a simple Italian city. This is here. It's in your neighborhood. It's real. Panic is a contagion in its own right, and it spreads through the city faster than any disease. The first reaction is flight. The wealthy are the first to go. You see them in the morning, their carts laden with chests of valuables, their families wrapped in fine cloaks, heading for the city gates. They are fleeing to their country estates, believing that the clean air of the countryside will protect them. They are, in a grimly ironic way, the very agents of the plague spread, carrying the infection with them to previously untouched villages. For those who cannot afford to leave the vast majority of the population, the city transforms into a trap. The gates that once offered a sense of security now feel like the bars of a cage. The narrow, crowded streets that were once vibrant and lively now seem menacing. Every passerby, a potential carrier of death. The social fabric of the city begins to unravel with terrifying speed. Neighbor turns away from neighbor. A family will bar their door and refuse to help the sick family next to them. The bonds of community, kinship, and friendship, forged over a lifetime, are dissolved in a matter of hours by a primal fear of contagion. People start to avoid each other in the street, giving one another a wide berth, their faces covered with cloths held to their noses. The church bells, which once marked the comforting rhythm of the day, now take on a new, dreadful purpose. They begin to toll for the dead. At first, it's just a few times a day. Then it becomes hourly. Soon, the bells are ringing almost constantly, a relentless, clanging funeral dirge for a city that is dying. The authorities, in a desperate attempt to stop the growing panic, eventually order the bells to be silenced. But the silence that follows is even more terrifying. The authorities try to assert control. The city council issues new ordinances. They order the streets to be cleaned, a futile gesture. They command that the bodies of the dead be buried quickly and outside the city walls. But the systems in place are not designed for a crisis of this magnitude. The graviturgs, at first, are overwhelmed. Soon, they too begin to fall sick and die, or they simply refuse the work, no matter the pay. A little known and rather poignant detail of this breakdown is what happened to wills and testaments. In normal times, a person's last will was a carefully considered document, drafted by a cleric or a notary, witnessed by reputable citizens. In the plague, all that formality vanished. People, knowing they had only hours to live, would shout their last wishes from their windows to any passerby who would listen. Notaries, if they could be found, would take depositions from a safe distance, standing in the middle of the street while the dying person whispered their bequests from a second-story window. The legal and social rituals that govern life and death simply disintegrated. The debate among historians about the mortality rate of the first wave of the Black Death is ongoing. Figures are notoriously difficult to confirm. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in a state of shock, often gave apocalyptic estimates, claiming that 9 out of 10 people died. Modern historians, using tax records and parish registers, suggest a figure closer to 1/3 or even 1/2 of the population in many areas. But to you, standing in the middle of this city, the statistical debate is meaningless. What you see is a world coming to an end, The wool-carded eyes 2 days after the swelling appeared. His body, wrapped in his simple shroud, is collected at night by a cart pulled by grim-faced men who hold vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces. He is not taken to the church graveyard. He is taken to a large pit dug in a field outside the city walls and tipped in with the others. There is no ceremony, no priest, no family present to mourn. He is just one more body on a growing pile. The empty house he left behind is a symbol of the city's fate. His neighbors eye it with a mixture of fear and greed. Who will claim his tools? Who will move into his rooms? But even that thought is tainted with terror. Is the house itself now poisoned? Can death linger in the walls, in the bedding, in the very air of the rooms where he died? The first person has fallen, and with him the illusion of safety, the comfort of order, and the belief in a world that makes sense. The city is now adrift in a sea of fear, and everyone is drowning, with the city now in the grip of full-blown panic. All eyes turn to the only people who are supposed to have answers, the doctors. But the men who step forward to face the pestilence are not the white-coated scientists of our modern imagination. They are a strange and varied group, operating on a system of medicine that is, to your 21st century eyes, almost entirely alien. The most learned among them are the university-trained physicians. They are a rare and expensive commodity, usually serving only the wealthiest clients. You see one on the street, and he is an impressive sight. He wears long robes, often trimmed with fur, and carries a walking stick, the symbol of his learned status. He doesn't touch his patients. He observes them from a distance, perhaps sniffing a vial of their urine, a primary diagnostic tool, and stroking his beard thoughtfully. His understanding of the disease is based on a medical theory that has dominated Western thought for over 1,000 years. The doctrine of the four humors. This theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks Hippocrates and Galen, holds that the human body is composed of four essential fluids, or humors: blood, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person has these four humors in perfect balance. Sickness is the result of an imbalance, too much of one, not enough of another. So, when this physician looks at a plague victim, he doesn't see a bacterium. He sees a body dangerously out of whack. The fever is a sign of excess heat and moisture. The dark color of the buboes is a clear indication of a surfeit of corrupt black bile. The treatment, therefore, is logical. According to his framework, you must rebalance the humors. The primary tool for this is bloodletting. The physician will instruct a lower-class practitioner, a barber surgeon, to open a vein and drain a specific amount of blood, believing this will reduce the heat and excess in the body. The practice, of course, does nothing to fight the infection and likely weakens the already struggling patient, hastening their death. Next on the medical hierarchy are the barber surgeons. These are the hands-on practitioners of the medical world. They are not university educated. They learn their trade through apprenticeship. They are members of a guild, just like the city's weavers and butchers. Their striped pole, which we still associate with barbershops today, originally symbolized the bloody bandages of their trade. They are the ones who perform the bloodletting, pull rotten teeth, set broken bones, and lance boils, including the dreaded buboes. Lancing the swellings was an incredibly dangerous job, exposing the surgeon directly to the highly infectious pus inside. Many barber surgeons were among the first to die. Then there are the apothecaries, the pharmacists of their day. Their shops are filled with the exotic and pungent smells of dried herbs, spices, and minerals. They create the remedies prescribed by the physicians. These might include complex herbal concoctions, often containing dozens of ingredients, some of them fantastically expensive, like powdered pearls or ground unicorn horn, which was usually narrow tusk. A common remedy was a poultice made of figs and cooked onions, mixed with butter, to be placed on the buboes to draw out the poison. But the humoral theory is only half the story. The other dominant theory of how the plague spreads is through miasma, or bad air. Everyone agrees that the disease is airborne, carried on a foul, corrupting wind. This miasma, they believe, emanates from stagnant walks, piles of rotting garbage, unburied corpses, and even from certain unfortunate alignments of the planets. The stench of the city, once a mere nuisance, is now seen as the very breath of death. This leads to a whole set of preventative measures aimed at purifying the air. The city council orders huge bonfires to be lit on street corners. The smoke believed to drive away the miasma. The wealthy burn incense, juniper, and rosemary in their homes. People walk around holding pomander, small metal balls filled with fragrant ambergris, musk, or cloves, or simply vinegar-soaked sponges to their noses. The iconic plague doctor costume, with its bird-like mask and long beak, is a later invention, but the principle behind it was born here. The beak was to be stuffed with aromatic herbs to filter out the poisoned air before it could be inhaled. One of the stranger and more specific preventative measures that becomes popular is the prescription of a particular diet. Physicians advise people to avoid foods that are considered moist and hot in the humoral system, like fish and most fruits. Instead, they recommend eating dry, cold foods like bread and certain vegetables. They also forbid public bathing, as the hot water and steam of the public baths are believed to open the pores of the skin, making it easier for the deadly miasma to enter the body. This is a fascinating historical point, as historians argue that this plague-induced fear of bathing contributed to a decline in personal hygiene in Europe that lasted for centuries. Of course, none of it works. The bloodletting weakens the sick, the lancing of buboes spreads the infection, and the bonfires do nothing to stop the fleas that are the true carriers of the Yersinia pestis bacterium. The people of the city are fighting a ghost with the wrong weapons. Their medical system is a complex, internally consistent, and deeply held intellectual framework. It has explanations for everything. It has prescribed treatments. The only problem is that it is completely, utterly wrong. You watch as a distraught family pays a small fortune for a physician's consultation. You see the barber surgeon arrive with his bloody knives. You smell the sweet, cloying scent of burning herbs from an apothecary's shop, and you see the death cart arrive at the same house a day later. The failure is absolute. The best educated minds, the most experienced hands, are powerless, and when the experts fail, when reason and established knowledge prove useless, people's minds turn elsewhere. They start looking for a different kind of explanation, a different kind of culprit. The search for a medical cure is failing. The search for a scapegoat is about to begin. The failure of medicine creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushes an overwhelming, all-encompassing question. Why? Not how is the disease spreading, but why is this happening to us? With the physicians and their remedies proving useless, the citizens turn to the only other authority that claims to have answers about the fundamental nature of the world, the church. You seek refuge from the horrors of the street inside the great stone cathedral. It's no longer a place of quiet contemplation. It is packed with desperate people. The air, once smelling of cruel incense, is now thick with the scent of fear and unwashed bodies. People are on their knees, praying with a fervor you have never seen before. Their prayers are not the calm, recited verses of a typical Sunday Mass. They are bargains, promises, and desperate pleas, muttered through tears. The priests, who just a few weeks ago were offering comforting platitudes about a distant punishment for distant sinners, now have a new sermon. You stand in the crowd and listen to a friar, his face gaunt, his voice cracking with emotion. As he preaches from the pulpit, he doesn't talk about me, asthma, or humoral imbalance. He talks about sin. The message is stark and terrifying. The plague is not a random sickness. It is a scourge of God. It is a divine punishment, a manifestation of God's righteous anger, sent down to punish a wicked and sinful world. He lists the sins of the people, his voice rising with each charge. Pride, evidenced by the vanity of the wealthy merchants. Greed, seen in the cheating shopkeepers and the charging of interest on loans. A practice known as usury. Envy of one's neighbor. Gluttony and drunkenness in the city's many taverns. And, of course, the ever-present sin of lust, a corruption that walks a fine line between being a civic necessity and a moral stain on the soul of the city. He paints a vivid picture. God is looking down from heaven and seeing a city that has forgotten him, a city consumed by worldly pleasures and petty concerns. This pestilence is his way of reminding them of his power, of the fragility of human life, and of the fires of hell that await the unrepentant. Every death, every bubo, every toll of the funeral bell is a personal message from an angry God. This explanation is, in its own way, more comforting than the medical one. The idea of a random, meaningless disease is terrifying because it is chaotic. It implies a universe without order or justice. But an angry God, that makes sense. It fits perfectly within their worldview. They have sinned, and now they are being punished. This is a framework they can understand. And more importantly, if the plague is a punishment, it means there might be a way to stop it. If they can appease God's anger, the punishment will cease. And so, the city transforms into a theater of frantic piety. Public religious processions become a daily event. Guild members, merchants, and common laborers march through the streets, holding aloft crucifixes and banners of their patron saints. They chant litanies and prayers for mercy, their voices mingling with the cries of the sick and dying. These processions, of course, are a public health disaster, gathering hundreds of people into close contact and helping the disease spread even faster. Some turn to more extreme forms of devotion. The most dramatic of these are the flagella Antis. A group of them arrives in the city one day. A grim procession of men stripped to the waist, their faces hidden by hoods. They march in a slow, lockstep rhythm, chanting mournful hymns. They carry leather scourges, often tipped with iron barbs. In the center of the market square, they form a circle and begin to whip themselves and each other in a ritualized, bloody spectacle of penance. They believe that by taking on this physical suffering, by mortifying their own flesh, they can take the sins of the city upon themselves and appease God's wrath. The flagella Anti movement is a fascinating, uncontroversial phenomenon. The church hierarchy was deeply suspicious of them. They operated outside of official church control. They claimed a direct line to God, and their leaders sometimes preached a radical, anti-clerical message. Pope Clement VI condemned them. But on the ground, in the plague-stricken cities, they were often greeted as heroes and saints by a desperate populace who saw their extreme piety as the only thing that might work. The debate among historians is whether the flagella Antis were a genuine grassroots spiritual movement or a form of mass hysteria, fueled by terror and a breakdown of social order. In the midst of all this, a strange and specific detail emerges in the sermons and the public prayers. While the priests condemn all sin, they begin to focus on certain sins more than others. They talk about the breakdown of social order, of women dressing above their station, of the young disrespecting their elders, and increasingly, they talk about the sins of the flesh. Lust, they argue, is a particularly potent poison to the soul of a community. It is a public sin, a visible corruption. You notice the shift. At first, the anger is directed inward. We have sin, our pride, our greed. But as the death toll continues to rise, as the processions fail, as the flagella Antis whips prove ineffective, the tone begins to change again. The collective guilt starts looking for a more specific focus. If God is still angry, despite all this prayer and penance, then perhaps the sin is not general and diffuse. Perhaps there is a specific, concentrated source of that sin, a cancer within the city that must be cut out. The question is no longer just, why is God angry? It's becoming, who is making God so angry? The search for a reason is slowly, but surely, turning into a search for someone to blame. The collective prayer and penance aren't working. The death carts still make their nightly rounds, their wheels groaning under an ever heavier load. The desperate piety has failed to appease God, and this failure breeds a new, more dangerous kind of desperation. The abstract idea of our sins is no longer a sufficient explanation for the sheer, relentless scale of the horror. The human mind, especially a mind under extreme stress, craves a simpler, more tangible narrative. It needs a villain. It needs a face to put on its fear and anger. The city is ripe for a scapegoat. The search for a culprit begins subtly, in the hushed conversations in the breadlines, in the fearful gossip exchanged over backyard fences. People start looking for someone who is other, someone who stands outside the traditional social order. The first targets are often the most marginalized and least understood members of society. Suspicion falls on strangers and travelers, people with no local family to defend them. Why are they here? Are they agents of some foreign power, sent to poison the city? It falls on the desperately poor and the vagrant, who are seen as morally weak and therefore more likely to be in league with dark forces. It falls on those who practice folk medicine, the wise women in the villages and city outskirts, who use herbs and poultices. Their traditional remedies, once seen as helpful, are now viewed with deep suspicion. If their cures are not sanctioned by the church or the university physicians, then their power must come from a darker source. But the most prominent and historically significant group to be blamed across Europe are the Jewish communities. In your city, the Jewish quarter is a distinct, often walled-in neighborhood. For centuries, they have lived as a community apart, tolerated but never fully integrated. Their religion is different, their customs are foreign, and their legal and economic status is precarious, often dependent on the shifting whims of the local ruler. Because the church forbade Christians from lending money, had interest the sin of usury. Many Jews had filled this essential economic niche, becoming the city's moneylenders. This made them both necessary and resented. Now, in the crucible of the plague, this long-simmering resentment boils over into paranoid fantasy. A monstrous rumor begins to circulate. The plague is not a disease at all, but a deliberate act of poisoning. The Jews, it is whispered, are systematically poisoning the city's wells, springs, and food supplies as part of an international conspiracy to destroy Christendom. This theory offers a complete, satisfying, and terrifying explanation for everything. It explains why the disease seems to strike so randomly. It explains why the doctors can't cure it. And it provides a clear, identifiable enemy to be fought. The evidence, there is none. But in a climate of fear, evidence is easily manufactured. People point to the fact that Jewish communities, often living in more isolated quarters with better sanitation practices, including religious requirements for hand washing and a clean water supply, sometimes had a lower initial mortality rate. This isn't seen as a result of hygiene. It's seen as proof that they knew how to avoid the poison because they were the ones administering it. One of the more bizarre and specific proofs offered at the time came from the examination of the wells. People would claim to have found small bags or packets of poison in the water. These were often little leather or cloth pouches containing a strange powder. What was in them? Historians who have studied the trial records from this period have suggested that these were likely just talismans or amulets, perhaps dropped by someone in the hopes of magically purifying the water, or even just unrelated debris. But in the hands of a panicked mob, a harmless folk charm becomes a terrorist's bomb. The hunt for a scapegoat is not always a bottom-up, spontaneous eruption of mob violence. Sometimes, it is cynically encouraged by those in power. A local lord or prince who is deeply in debt to Jewish moneylenders might see the rising tide of public anger as a convenient opportunity. By sanctioning an attack on the Jewish community, he can cancel his debts, seize their property, and redirect the public's fury away from his own failure to manage the crisis. The line between genuine popular hysteria and calculated political opportunism is, as historians continue to debate, incredibly blurry. You witness the mood in the city turn venomous. The way people look at their Jewish neighbors changes overnight. The fear of contagion is replaced by the hatred of the poisoner. A Jewish man walking across the market square is met with glares and muttered curses. A child throws a stone at the gate of the Jewish quarter. The city guards, who are supposed to maintain order, do nothing. They share the same fears and prejudices as the rest of the populace. The psychological need for a scapegoat is a powerful force. It simplifies a complex and terrifying reality. It transforms the victims of a tragedy into righteous warriors fighting an evil enemy. It provides an outlet for feelings of helplessness, turning passive suffering into active aggression. It creates a sense of shared purpose in a community that is fracturing under the strain of the plague. By uniting against a common enemy, the people of a city can, for a moment, feel a renewed sense of community and control over their fate. The stage is now set. The city has its divine reason, the wrath of God, and it is beginning to identify its earthly agents, the poisoneress. But the net of blame is still being cast. The Jewish community is the most obvious target, but in a society obsessed with the sin of lust, another group, already living on the margins, is about to be drawn into this deadly narrative of guilt and retribution. The gaze of the fearful city is beginning to turn towards Rose Lane. The city is a tinderbox of fear and suspicion, and now it needs only a spark. While the terrifying rumors of a Jewish conspiracy to poison the wells gain traction, another parallel narrative begins to weave itself into the public consciousness. This one is less about international conspiracy and more about internal moral right. It's a story that finds its villain not in a separate world-off quarter, but in a place that has always been both a part of the city and apart from it. Rose Lane. The logic is insidious and deeply rooted in the city's psyche for generations. The women of the red light district have been labeled as sinners. Theologians called them vessels of impurity, and popular culture portrayed them as morally weakened and trustworthy. They were the city's necessary evil, a constant, visible reminder of humanity's fall from grace. Now, with God's anger so terrifyingly apparent, their symbolic stain becomes a literal one. The argument, whispered in confessionals and preached from pulpits, goes something like this. God's wrath is not just about general sinfulness. He is specifically disgusted by the most public and shameless sin. And what is more public and shameless than the nightly spectacle on Rose Lane? The very existence of this officially sanctioned district of lust is an affront to a righteous God. It's like the city is waving a flag of its own depravity, inviting divine retribution. The plague, therefore, is not just a punishment. It is a direct response to the specific, festering wound on the city's soul. You see how this idea takes hold. It's simpler than the poison plot. It doesn't require a belief in a vast, hidden conspiracy. It only requires a belief in what people have been taught their entire lives, that these women are unclean. The leap from morally unclean to plague spreading is a short and easy one for a terrified mind to make. The suspicion doesn't rely on evidence of poisoning wells. It relies on a more spiritual, metaphorical kind of contagion. Their sinfulness, it is argued, is so potent that it has polluted the very air of the city, creating the miasma that the doctors talk about. Their bodies, given over to lust, are seen as uniquely fertile ground for the pestilence to take root and flourish. They are not just victims of the plague, they are its incubators, its amplifiers. A particularly cruel and absurd piece of folk belief begins to spread, that a man can catch the plague from one of these women, not through a physical act, but simply by being in her presence, by breathing the same sinful air. This idea is a perfect fusion of the medical theory of miasma and the theological concept of sin. It makes the women of Rose Lane radioactive with a spiritual and physical sickness. You start to hear stories that confirm this bias. A merchant who was a known visitor to the stews falls ill, and people nod knowingly. It wasn't just bad luck. He was tainted by his association with them. The fact that dozens of virtuous citizens are also dying is conveniently ignored. The human mind is excellent at finding patterns that reinforce its existing beliefs, a phenomenon we now call confirmation bias. In the 14th century, it was just called common sense. One of the lesser-known historical factors that played into this was the legal status of these women. They were, in many cities, legal infames, or infamous persons. This was a formal legal category inherited from Roman law. It meant that, while they might have certain protections, they lacked the full legal standing of other citizens. They couldn't hold public office, act as witnesses in most court cases, or make a formal accusation. This legal marginalization made them incredibly vulnerable. They were, in essence, a group of people who could be accused of anything with very little ability to defend themselves. The system was designed to keep them on the outside. And now, that system made them the perfect target. Historians debate the precise mechanism by which the blame shifted. Was it primarily driven by the church, with priests using their pulpits to focus the public's anxiety on a group already condemned as immoral? Or was it more of a grassroots movement, with the common people, in their terror, organically latching onto the most obvious symbols of uncleanliness in their midst? It was most likely a feedback loop, with the anxieties of the populace being amplified and given theological weight by the clergy, and the clergy's pronouncements confirming the darkest fears of the populace. You see the practical effects of this shifting blame immediately on Rose Lane. The street, once a bustling, if notorious, part of the city's nightlife, becomes a place of fear and menace. Men who were once customers now hurry past, pulling their cloaks tight, their faces a mixture of fear and contempt. The women who stand in the doorways are no longer just sinners or objects of lust. They are seen as personifications of the plague itself. The city's delicate, hypocritical balance has been shattered. The necessary evil is no longer seen as necessary. It's seen as a fatal liability. The silent contract tolerance in exchange for service and taxes has been broken. The women who were once a contained and managed part of the urban landscape are now recast as the enemy within. A fifth column of pestilence and sin that threatens the very survival of the city. The suspicion has found its focus. The hunt is about to begin. The change, when it comes, is not a gradual slide but a sudden, brutal pivot. The city's official policy towards the women of Rose Lane, a policy built on decades of pragmatic tolerance, is dismantled almost overnight. The same city council that once profited from the licensed brothels now sees them as a source of mortal danger and public shame. You witness this shift firsthand in the market square. A new proclamation is read out by the town crier. His voice, usually a monotone rote announcing tax deadlines or market regulations, is now filled with a solemn gravity. The proclamation, issued by the mayor and the city council, is a complete reversal of their long-standing position. It declares that, in light of God's manifest displeasure, all houses of ill repute are to be closed immediately. The practice of prostitution is, henceforth, outlawed within the city walls. Any woman found engaging in the trade, or any landlord found housing them, will be subject to severe penalties, public whipping, branding, or banishment from the city. The justification is twofold, a neat blend of the spiritual and the practical. Spiritually, it's presented as an act of civic penance, a desperate attempt to cleanse the city of its most visible sin and regain God's favor. Practically, it's framed as a public health measure, a way to stop the spread of the pestilence by shutting down its supposed source, the city council, whose members had failed to protect the populace through medical or logistical means, is now rebranding itself as the guardian of the city's moral and physical purity. This is a profound betrayal. The women of Rose Lane had operated within a system. They paid their taxes, adhered to the regulations like wearing the identifying yellow ribbon, and in return, they received a measure of protection from the law. They were, in a sense, employees of a civic enterprise, and their employer had just fired them and thrown them to the wolves. All the rules that once governed their existence and offered them a sliver of security have been vaporized. The immediate effect is chaos on Rose Lane. The brothel keepers, the madams who ran the official stay houses, bar their doors. Some try to disappear, melting back into the general population. Others, seeing which way the wind is blowing, turn on the women who worked for them, evicting them onto the street to save their own skins. The women are left in an impossible situation. They are now illegal, but they have no other means of survival. Their profession, their only source of income, has been criminalized, and their very presence in the city is now a liability. A small but telling historical detail from this period is the symbolic nature of these closures. In some towns, the authorities didn't just lock the doors of the brothels. They performed a public ritual. They might board up the windows in a public ceremony, or even have a priest perform a rite of exorcism on the building to cleanse it of its sinful past. This wasn't just about changing the law. It was about theatrical, public repentance. It was a performance for an audience of one. The angry God they believed was watching. The city guards, who once patrolled Rose Lane to keep the peace and ensure the official rules were followed, now patrol it with a different purpose. They are no longer there to manage the trade. They are there to eradicate it. Their attitude towards the women changes from one of indifferent tolerance to open hostility. You see a guard roughly shove a woman who is lingering in a doorway, telling her to move on or face the whip. The veneer of order has been stripped away, revealing the raw prejudice that always lay just beneath the surface. This official change in policy has another crucial effect. It gives the general populace a license to hate. For years, they had lived alongside these women, perhaps with a mixture of contempt, pity, and furtive curiosity. But the women were a sanctioned part of the city. To attack them would have been to break the city's own rules. Now, the city has declared them outlaws. The official condemnation from the authorities validates the public's worst fears and prejudices. It transforms their simmering anxiety into righteous anger. It's no longer just a personal opinion that these women are a source of contagion. It's now the official position of the city government. Historians who study this period often focus on the legal documents, the proclamations, the new ordinances, the court records. What these documents reveal is a fascinating and terrifying aspect of how societies respond to existential threats. When faced with a crisis they cannot control like a plague, authorities often resort to controlling what they can. The behavior of marginalized groups. It's a classic case of symbolic politics. Unable to stop the real enemy, they create a new, weaker enemy that they can visibly and publicly defeat. The closing of the brothels didn't save a single life from the plague, but it created the powerful illusion of decisive action. You see the fear in the eyes of the women who have been cast out. They huddle in small groups in the back alleys, trying to stay out of sight. They have been stripped of their livelihood, their homes, and their legal status all at once. They are now pariahs in the truest sense of the word. They are trapped in a city that is dying, and that city has just decided that they are to blame. The fragile ecosystem of tolerance, built on centuries of cynical pragmatism, has collapsed. The apathetic landlord has become the zealous prosecutor. The stage is not just set for blame anymore. It's set for a purge. With the official condemnation in place, the second wave of attack begins. It's a war fought not with swords and pikes, but with whispers, rumors, and slander. The vague, spiritual idea that the women of Rose Lane were polluting the city with their sin now crystallizes into something far more concrete and terrifying. They are not just passive amplifiers of the plague. They are its active, malicious agents. They are poisoners. The rumor starts, as it so often does, in a place of public gathering, a tavern. The market stall, someone claims to have overheard two of those women laughing about how the plague was good for business, or how it was finally punishing the respectable folk who had always looked down on them. The story is almost certainly a fabrication, a projection of the public's own fears and resentments. But in the current climate, it's believable. It spreads like wildfire. Soon, the stories become more specific, more detailed, and more monstrous. A new narrative emerges, a chilling echo of the accusations being leveled against the Jewish community. The women, it is said, are deliberately spreading the disease. How? Through their trade, of course, but also through more sinister means. A rumor takes hold that they are in possession of a special plague ointment or poison powder, given to them by demons, or perhaps by the Jews themselves, linking the two scapegoated groups into a single, grand conspiracy of evil. The stories describe how they would use this substance. They would smear it on doorknobs, on church benches, on the handles of the public water pumps. They would secretly apply it to the clothes of their clients, who would then carry the sickness home to their unsuspecting wives and children. The narrative is brilliantly devious because it's impossible to disprove. Every new death in the city becomes potential evidence of their malevolent work. Demon eyes. His wife tearfully remembers that he bought a new shirt in the market a week ago. Perhaps one of them had touched it. A child falls ill. The mother recalls a strange woman who walked past their house the day before. This rumor is powerful because it explains a key, terrifying feature of the plague: its seeming randomness. Why does one person in a house die while another survives? Why does it strike in one street and not the next? A random, invisible germ is a deeply unsatisfying explanation for a pre-modern mind, but a human agent, a poisoner moving silently through the city, choosing their victims. That makes a terrifying kind of sense. It provides a narrative, an enemy, and a feeling of understanding. However, what a particularly strange and telling detail that appears in some contemporary accounts is the accusation that they used the gays to spread the plague, the evil eye. It was believed that a person of sufficiently evil intent could transmit disease or misfortune simply by looking at someone. The women of Rose Lane, already considered morally corrupt, were seen as prime candidates for possessing such a dangerous power. This belief blended folk superstition with the new terror of the plague, creating a potent and deadly combination. You see the effect of these rumors on the city's collective psyche. The women are no longer just outcasts. They are monsters. They are witches in league with the devil. People begin to remember strange things. The old woman who lived at the end of Rose Lane and kept cats. She was probably brewing potions. The woman with the unusual birthmark, clearly a sign from the devil. Every small deviation from the norm, every personal eccentricity, is reinterpreted through the lens of this new, paranoid narrative. Historians are still debating the origins of these specific poisoner narratives. Were they spontaneous inventions of the popular imagination, a kind of collective nightmare, or were they deliberately crafted and spread by certain individuals or groups to achieve a specific goal? For example, by linking the prostitutes to the Jewish community, it strengthened the case against both, creating a more convincing and all-encompassing conspiracy theory. It made the seemingly random acts of violence feel like part of a larger, justified war against a unified enemy. The power of these rumors lies in their ability to provide simple answers to complex questions. Why is this happening? They are doing it. Who is to blame? They are. What can we do? We must stop them. The rumor transforms a passive, terrified populace into an active, angry mob. It gives them a sense of agency. They can't fight the miasma, but they can hunt the poisoner. You walk past what used to be Rose Lane. It's now deserted and silent. The windows are shuttered, but the silence is not peaceful. It's menacing. The street itself is now seen as a cursed place. Children are told not to go near it. People make the sign of the cross as they hurry past. The women who once lived here have scattered, gone into hiding in the city's poorest slums and back alleys. But hiding is no longer enough. The rumors have given them a new identity, not as sinners, but as enemy combatants. The city is no longer just looking to banish them. It's looking to hunt them down. The power of a lie, told loud enough and often enough in a time of fear, has become a death sentence. The simmering pot of rumor and hatred finally boils over. It happens in the heart of the city, in the main square, which has become the stage for the city's ongoing drama of fear and repentance. The catalyst is not a city council proclamation or a back alley whisper, but a public sermon. The man who delivers it is a traveling preacher, a charismatic friar from a mendicant order. These wandering preachers were a common feature of medieval life. They were often fiery, populist speakers, known for their dramatic, emotionally charged sermons that captivated the common folk in a way the dry, Latinate liturgy of the parish priests often could not. This particular friar has a reputation for his apocalyptic warnings and his fierce denunciations of sin. In a city ravaged by plague, he finds a deeply receptive audience. He stands on a wooden platform, his thin frame silhouetted against the stone facade of the cathedral. His voice, honed by years of open-air preaching, rings out across the square, drawing a large crowd. He begins, as expected, by reminding them of God's terrible wrath, of the pestilence as a divine scourge. He speaks of the failure of their Persian processions. He asks the crowd, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, Why does God not relent? Then comes the turn. He moves from the general to the specific. He tells them that God's anger cannot be appeased as long as the serpents of sin are allowed to nest in the very heart of their city. He doesn't just talk about abstract lust. He points, his finger trembling with righteous fury, in the direction of the now shuttered Rose Lane. He gives the nameless fear a name. He calls the women who lived there the devil's handmaidens. He accuses them of being the leaky vessel through which the plague was poured into the city. He blends all the circulating rumors into one cohesive, damning narrative. He claims they have made a pact with Satan, trading their souls for the power to spread the pestilence. He weaves in the stories of the poison ointment and the evil eye, presenting them not as rumors, but as established facts. And then, he does something that pushes the situation to a new level. He singles out a specific individual. He names a woman. Let's call her Agnes, who was a well-known figure on Rose Lane, perhaps one of the older, more established women who ran a small, independent operation. He claims to have irrefutable proof of her guilt. He tells the crowd a story about a godly man who, on his deathbed, confessed that Agnes had given him a cursed apple which brought the plague upon him. This is a critical moment. Blaming a faceless group is one thing. Naming a name, providing a concrete target for the mob's fury, is another. The friar has just handed the crowd a lit match. The proof he offers is, of course, hearsay of the most dubious kind, a deathbed confession that cannot be verified. But to the terrified, grieving crowd, it sounds like gospel. They are desperate for a culprit, and he has just delivered one. Gift-trapped in theological certainty, a man in the crowd, whose wife died just a week earlier, shouts out Agnes' name. Another voice joins him, then another. The name echoes across the square, turning from an accusation into a verdict. The historical basis for this kind of event is well documented. Religious figures, from high-ranking bishops to lowly wandering friars, played a crucial role in legitimizing the persecution of scapegoats during the Black Death. Their sermons provided the theological framework that transformed mob violence from a criminal act into a sacred duty. Whether these preachers, like the friar in our story, genuinely believe their own rhetoric, or were cynically manipulating the public sphere is a question that historians continue to debate. Some were likely true believers, caught up in the same apocalyptic hysteria as their flock. Others may have seen it as an opportunity to increase their own power and influence. The friar concludes his sermon with a call to action. Cut out the cancer. He screams, his voice hoarse. Purify this city with fire and with faith. Do not suffer the witch to live among you. He is deliberately invoking the biblical injunction against witchcraft, elevating the charge from simple poisoning to diabolical heresy. The effect is instantaneous. The crowd, which had been a collection of frightened individuals, coalesces into a single organism. The mob, their shared fear has been forged into a shared purpose. They have their target, and they have the blessing of a man of God. The abstract anger has found its focus. You watch as a group of men, their faces grim, detach themselves from the crowd. They are not the city's dregs. They are respectable artisans and shopkeepers, men who have lost family and friends, men who are convinced they are doing God's work. They pick up stones, pieces of wood, anything that can be used as a weapon. They begin to move, not with the chaos of a riot, but with the chilling purpose of a lynch mob. They are heading in the direction of the slum where Agnes is rumored to be hiding. The first public accusation has been made. It has been specific, personal, and sanctified from the pulpit. The line between thought and action, between accusation and violence, has been irrevocably crossed. The city is no longer just looking for a scapegoat to blame. It is now actively hunting one down to punish. The friar's sermon acts as a declaration of war, and the city's authorities, who should be the arbiters of justice, are swept up in the tide. The mob that formed after the sermon doesn't get to Agnes first. The city guard, now acting with the full backing of the panicked city council, intervenes, but they are not there to protect her. They are there to formalize the hunt. What follows is not a chaotic, spontaneous riot, but something far more chilling, an organized, systematic purge. The city council, seeing the fury of the populace, realizes that a simple banishment is no longer enough. The people demand a more definitive, more cathartic resolution. They need a trial, a confession, and a punishment that fits the apocalyptic scale of the crime. The hunt for scapegoats becomes official city policy. Patrols of city guards, sometimes accompanied by deputized citizens brandishing makeshift weapons, begin to sweep through the city's poorest quarters. Their primary targets are the women who used to work on Rose Lane, now scattered and in hiding. Their secondary targets are anyone associated with them, landlords who might be sheltering them, friends, even family members. The process is brutal and efficient. They move from one squalid tenement to the next, kicking in doors, dragging people out into the street. An accusation is all it takes. A neighbor, settling an old grudge, can simply point a finger and say, "She was one of them." A person's past is their verdict. If a woman was known to have worked in the stews, she is presumed guilty. You witness a raid on a rundown boarding house near the city's edge. The guards storm the building, their movements swift and violent. They drag out two terrified women. One is young, barely more than a girl. The other is older, her face a mask of defiant terror. They are not questioned. They are simply bound and thrown onto a cart. Their meager possessions are tossed into the street, and the neighbors, people who might have shared a loaf of bread with them a month ago, now watch in silence or shout insults. This organized cleansing serves a crucial psychological purpose for the city. It creates an illusion of control. The plague itself is an invisible, uncontrollable enemy, but these women are visible. They can be rounded up, imprisoned, and punished. Every arrest feels like a small victory in the war against the pestilence. The city council can point to the growing number of prisoners as proof that they are doing something, that they are actively fighting the source of the city's suffering. One of the more sinister aspects of this process is the financial incentive. According to the new ordinances, the property of anyone convicted of spreading the plague can be seized by the city. This creates a perverse motivation for accusations. A person who owes money to one of these women, or a greedy neighbor who covets her small plot of land, now has it powerful tool at their disposal. The witch hunt becomes a vehicle for settling personal scores and for personal enrichment. This fusion of genuine panic and cold-hearted opportunism is a recurring theme in historical persecutions. The question of whether the leaders of these hunts were true believers or cynical manipulators is a subject of endless debate among historians. Was the mayor who signed the arrest warrants a genuinely terrified man who believed he was saving his city? Or was he a shrewd politician who saw a way to consolidate his power, enrich the city's coffers, and deflect blame for his own failures? The most likely answer is that he was a complex mixture of both. A little-known fact about medieval law is that in cases of exceptional crimes, such as treason or heresy, normal legal procedures could be suspended. The crime of plague spreading was quickly elevated to this level. This meant that the accused lost many of the rights they might have had in a normal criminal case. They could be held without charge indefinitely. They were not entitled to a defender. And, most importantly, the court could authorize the use of extraordinary means to obtain a confession. This was a legalistic euphemism for torture. The city's jail, a place that normally held petty thieves and drunkards, begins to fill with women. They are thrown into dark, damp cells, often crowded together, with little food or water. They are no longer individuals. They are a collection, a category of witch or poisoner. Their arrest is not the beginning of a legal process designed to determine guilt or innocence. It is the first step in a ritual designed to produce a confession. The verdict has already been decided in the court of public opinion and from the preacher's pulpit. The legal proceedings that will follow are not about discovering the truth. They are about confirming a story that the city desperately needs to believe. As you watch the cart with the two captured women rumble through the streets toward the jail, you see the faces of the onlookers. Some are gleeful, triumphant. Others are fearful, but most are just numb, their faces blank. This has become the new normal. The city, in its frantic search for a cure, has become sick with a different kind of disease, a fever of hatred and paranoia. The hunt is on, and it will not end until it has a sacrifice. The cart carrying the arrested women rumbles through the jeering crowds and stops before a squat, foreboding stone building adjacent to the city hall. This is where the next, and most terrible, phase of the process begins. This is where the city will get its truth. You don't follow them inside, but you understand what happens in a place like this. The logic is as inescapable as the stone walls. The room they are taken to is not a courtroom. It is a chamber, often located in a cellar or a tower, away from the public eye and ear. It is equipped with an array of terrifyingly simple and effective tools: ropes, pulleys, braziers, and heavy iron implements. This is the torture chamber, and the men who work here are not wild sadists. They are municipal employees, officials of the court. They see themselves not as tormentors, but as instruments of justice, tasked with a difficult but necessary job, extracting the truth from a recalcitrant body. To understand what happens next, you have to understand the medieval legal philosophy that underpins it. In their system, the highest form of proof was a full confession. A confession was considered the queen of proofs, more valuable than witness testimony or circumstantial evidence. The problem was, how do you get a confession from someone who is guilty and knows that confessing means certain death? The answer was torture. The theory, as laid out by legal scholars of the time, was that physical pain could loosen the tongue and break the devil's hold over a sinner's soul, allowing the truth to emerge. It was not seen as a punishment. Punishment came after the conviction. Torture was an investigative tool, a legitimate, if extreme, part of the judicial process, especially in cases of heresy or treason, the category into which plague spreading now fell. The process was often highly ritualized and recorded by a notary. The accused would first be brought into the chamber and simply shown the instruments. This was the first degree of torture. The teary tie, or thread, the magistrate would describe, in cold, clinical detail, what each tool did and what would happen if the accused refused to cooperate. For many, this psychological torment was enough to break their will. If they still maintained their innocence, the process would escalate. The methods varied from place to place, but some were terrifyingly common. One of the most widely used was the strap padu. The victims' hands were tied behind their back, and the rope was slung over a pulley on the ceiling. They would then be hoisted into the air, dislocating their shoulders and causing excruciating pain. They could be left hanging, or they could be jerked drop part way and then stopped abruptly, compounding the injury. Another common method involved water. The water cure forced the victim to ingest vast quantities of water, creating a horrifying sensation of drowning. Or they might use instruments designed to crush limbs, like the boot, a device that progressively squeezed the foot and lower leg, or thumbs bruise for the hands. One of the more obscure but chillingly detailed aspects of this process was the role of the doctor. Often, a physician or surgeon would be present during the torture. Their job was not to alleviate suffering, but to advise the torturer on how much the victim could endure without dying prematurely. The goal was not to kill the accused. A dead prisoner cannot confess, but to keep them hovering in the space between life and death, where pain could do its work. The questions put to the women in this chamber are not open-ended. They are leading unspecific. The magistrate doesn't ask, "Did you do something wrong?" He asks, "Where did you get the poison? Who were your accomplices? Did you renounce your baptism? Did you attend the witch's Sabbath?" The narrative has already been written by the rumors on the street in the friar's sermon. The purpose of the torture is simply to get the accused to recite that narrative back to the court. Historians who have studied the transcripts of these trials are often struck by how similar the confessions are, even from different cities and different countries. The accused would confess to the same fantastic crimes: flying on broomsticks, kissing the devil in the form of a black goat, mixing potions from the fat of unbaptized infants, and, of course, receiving a powder from a demon with which to cause the plague. The debate is why this is so. Is it because this is what a pan-European diabolical conspiracy was actually doing? Or is it because these were the questions the interrogators were asking, the stories they were feeding to their victims, who, in a delirium of pain, would confess to anything to make it stop? The overwhelming consensus is the latter. The torture chamber was not a place where truth was discovered. It was a place where it was manufactured. The truth that emerges from this room is a perfect reflection of the city's deepest fears. It confirms that the plague is not a random act of nature, but a deliberate act of evil. It confirms that there is a conspiracy. It confirms that God's anger is justified, and it gives the authorities a signed confession, a legal document that transforms a lynching into a lawful execution. The screams from this hidden room are the sounds of a city reassuring itself, proving to itself that it understands the evil it is facing and has found a way to defeat it. Imagine Agnes, the woman named by the friar. After hours in that chamber, her body is broken, her mind a fog of pain and terror. The magistrate stands before her, his face impassive, and asks the same questions again and again. Who gave you the poison? How many have you killed? Name your accomplices. At some point, the instinct for self-preservation collapses. The only goal left is to make the pain stop. And so, she begins to talk. She doesn't confess to what she did. She confesses to what they want to hear. The notary, sitting at a small desk in the corner, his pen scratching across the parchment, records her confession. It's a rambling, incoherent narrative, a patchwork of her own nightmares and the interrogator's leading questions. Yes, she says, her voice a ragged whisper. She did receive a poison. Where did she get it? From a tall man in black, with eyes that burned like coals, who met her at a crossroads during a full moon. This is a classic trope of diabolical pact, a story she has probably heard in sermons and folktales her whole life. In her delirium, it becomes her reality. What was the poison made of? The magistrate suggests a few ingredients, gleaned from popular superstition. Was it made from spiders and toads? He might ask. Yes, she whispers. Spiders and toads, in the heart of an unbaptized child. Yes, that too. The notary dutifully writes it all down. The most crucial part of the confession, from the authorities' point of view, is the naming of accomplices. This is the key to widening the net, to proving the existence of a conspiracy, and to justifying further arrests. The magistrate pressures her. You did not act alone. Who else was at the Sabbath? Name the other women who took the devil's pact. Under duress, she names names. Perhaps she names other women from Rose Lane, women she competed with or disliked. Perhaps she names people at random, names that just float into her pain-addled mind. Or, in a final, tragic act of spite, she might name the wife of the man who accused her, or the sister of the guard who arrested her. These accusations, born of agony and despair, will be treated as factual evidence, condemning other innocent people to the same fate. This is how witch hunts spread. Through a chain reaction of forced confessions, she confesses to everything they ask of her. She admits to smearing the poison on the church door, to cursing the baker's well, to causing the death of a specific merchant and his family. She confesses to attending a witch's Sabbath in a clearing in the woods, where she danced with demons and performed obscene rituals. The confession becomes a wild, fantastical story, a piece of dark fiction co-authored by the interrogator and his victim. A fascinating and heartbreaking detail found in some historical trial records is the retracted confession. Sometimes, after being returned to their cell and having a day or two to recover from the immediate agony of torture, a victim would recant. They would tell the jailer or a visiting priest that their confession was a lie, forced out of them by the pain. But this rarely helped their case. In the eyes of the court, a retraction was not proof of innocence. It was proof that the devil had regained his hold on their soul, forcing them to deny the truth they had revealed. The only solution was to take them back to the chamber and torture them again, until they reconfessed. The system was a perfect, inescapable trap. The confession of Agnes, now a formal legal document, signed by the notary and witnessed by the court officials, is a powerful weapon. It's no longer just a rumor or a preacher's accusation. It is a certified fact. It can be read aloud to the public, proving that the authorities were right all along. It provides the legal justification for the next step, a trial and execution. This process highlights a central and still debated question among legal historians. Did the people running these trials, the magistrates, the notaries, the judges, genuinely believe in the fantastic confessions they were extracting? Or were they cynical bureaucrats, knowingly manufacturing evidence to satisfy a political need? The answer is likely uncomfortably complex. Many probably did believe. They lived in a world where the supernatural was an everyday reality. They believed in God, so they believed in the devil. The idea of diabolical conspiracies was not just a fantasy. It was a plausible explanation for the inexplicable horror of the plague. They likely saw the torture not as a way to create a lie, but as a holy struggle to wrest a soul from the clutches of Satan and expose his work on earth. Once the confession is secured, Agnes's utility is almost at an end. She is no longer a person. She is a piece of evidence. Her broken body is proof of the city's righteousness. Her first words are the foundation upon which the city will build its narrative of salvation. She is led from the dark chamber, blinking in the sudden light, her fate sealed not by any crime she committed, but by a story she was forced to tell. The story is a lie, but it's a lie the city needs more than it needs the truth. Agnes's confession does more than just seal her own fate. It becomes a thread, connecting her to the other scapegoated groups in the city and weaving them all into a single, terrifying tapestry of conspiracy. The interrogators are not just interested in her personal sins. They are trying to map out the entire network of evil they believe is at work. In the confession, extracted under duress, Agnes is prompted to link her supposed crimes to the city's Jewish community. The magistrate might ask, "The tall man in black who gave you the poison, did he not have the hooked nose and greedy eyes of a Jew? Or the powder he gave you, was it not the same powder the Jews have been using to poison the wells?" In her agony, Agnes agrees. Yes, the demon looked like a caricature of a Jew. Yes, the poison was supplied by a specific Jewish moneylender. The notary's pen scratches away, dutifully recording this evidence. The result is a document of breathtaking bigotry, a fusion of misogyny and antisemitism. It's a grand unified theory of all the city's fears. The narrative now goes like this. The Jews, in their eternal hatred of Christendom, are the masterminds behind the plague. They are too cunning to do all the dirty work themselves, so they recruit the most morally weakened, corrupt individuals within the Christian community to act as their agents, the prostitutes, the heretics, the witches. This connection is strategically brilliant for the persecutors. It makes the case against both groups stronger. The accusations against the Jews that they are poisoning wells can seem abstract and hard to prove, but when it confessed, which confirms the story, it gives the accusation a new, terrifying credibility. Conversely, the idea that a few marginalized women could cause such a devastating plague might seem far-fetched, but when they are portrayed as foot soldiers in a well-funded, international conspiracy led by the Jews, their supposed power suddenly makes more sense. Each scapegoat's guilt reinforces the others. This linking of undesirable groups is a classic tactic in the history of persecution. The authorities are not just punishing individuals. They are defining the boundaries of their own community by creating a composite monster that represents everything they are not. The good Christian of the city is pious, orderly, sexually restrained, and racially pure. The enemy is a hydra-headed beast, the lecherous witch, the greedy Jewish financier, the secretive heretic, all working in concert. A specific, and often overlooked, historical element that gets woven into these confessions is the charge of ritual murder and host desecration. For centuries, anti-Semitic propaganda had included the blood libel, the vile accusation that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in Passover rituals. Now, this old slander is updated for the plague era. Agnes's confession might include a lurid tale of how the plague powder was made, involving the blood of a stolen Christian baby mixed by a rabbi, and which over a demonic fire. She might also be forced to confess to host desecration, a crime considered even more heinous than murder. This was the belief that Jews would steal the consecrated wafer, the host, from a church, believing it to be the literal body of Christ, and then stab, burn, or otherwise defile it as a way of reenacting the crucifixion. In the context of the plague, this accusation took on a new power. The host was the ultimate symbol of God's grace and protection. To defile it was to attack the city's spiritual immune system, leaving it vulnerable to divine punishment like the pestilence. Agnes's confession proves that the prostitutes and the Jews are in league, attacking the city on both a physical level with poison and a spiritual one with blasphemy. The historical debate around these combined confessions is intense. Some scholars argue that they demonstrate a calculated, top-down strategy by church and secular authorities to eliminate inconvenient minority groups. Others see it as a more organic process, a kitchen sink approach to paranoia, where every existing prejudice and fear in society was thrown into the pot. The truth is likely a combination of both. A public primed by centuries of prejudice to believe these things, and authorities who were more than willing to exploit and formalize those beliefs for their own ends. The consequences of this expanded conspiracy theory are immediate and deadly. Armed with Agnes's confession, the city guards now have the legal justification to raid the Jewish quarter. The two parallel persecutions now merge into a single, horrific event. The same cart that carried Agnes to prison is now used to haul away the rabbi and other leaders of the Jewish community. They will be taken to the same chamber, shown the same instruments, and forced to corroborate the story that Agnes was forced to tell. The city has now completely lost its grip on reality. It is in the grip of a shared, violent psychosis. It has created a fictional narrative of a vast conspiracy and is now busy populating that narrative with real victims. The connections are all forced. The evidence is all manufactured. But it feels true to the people living through it. They are no longer just punishing a few fallen women. They are fighting a holy war against a grand coalition of evil, a shadow army whose leaders they have conveniently identified among their own neighbors. The trial, when it finally happens, is not a trial in any modern sense of the word. It's a piece of political theater, a public ritual designed to legitimize a conclusion that has already been reached. The venue is the city's main square, the same place where the friar delivered his incendiary sermon. A wooden scaffold has been erected in front of the town hall, with seats for the city's secular and religious dignitaries, the mayor, the council members, the bishop's representative, Agnes and the others, the women who were arrested with her. And now, the leaders of the Jewish community dragged into the same net are lead out onto the scaffold. They are gaunt and broken, barely able to stand. Their bodies bear the marks of the interrogation chamber. They are dressed in simple, coarse shifts, the garments of the condemned. The charge sheet is read out by a clerk. It's a long, rambling document, a summary of the fantastical confessions. It lists the crimes in relentless detail, making a pact with the devil, brewing plague poisons, desecrating the host, conspiring to overthrow Christendom. The crowd, which has packed the square, listens with a mixture of pious horror and grim satisfaction. This is what they came to see. This is the confirmation of their fears, the justification for their hatred. There is no defense attorney. The concept of innocent until proven guilty does not apply here. In cases of heresy and witchcraft, the accused were guilty by definition. The purpose of the trial is not to debate the evidence, but to present it. And the star piece of evidence is the confession itself. The clerk reads Agnes's testimony in a loud, clear voice, the lurid details of the witches, Sabbath and the poison making echoing across the square. In some historical cases of this kind, the accused were asked to publicly affirm their confession. The magistrate would turn to the prisoner and ask, "Do you confirm that this testimony, which you gave freely and without coercion, is the truth?" This was the final, cruel twist of the night. The victim, standing before a mob that is baying for their blood, knowing that a retraction would only lead back to the torture chamber, would have no choice but to nod or whisper yes. Their public assent, however forced, was the final seal on the proceedings, transforming a coerced lie into a public truth. The verdict is a foregone conclusion. The panel of judges, a combination of city councilmen and ecclesiastical authorities, huddles together for a few moments in a pantomime of deliberation. Then the lead magistrate stands and pronounces the sentence. Guilty. Guilty of witchcraft, of heresy, of murder, of poisoning. The sentence is death. A fascinating and often misunderstood aspect of this process is the role of the secular versus the religious authorities. Technically, the church, through the Inquisition or a bishop's court, could investigate and rule on matters of heresy. But the church itself was forbidden from shedding blood. So, after pronouncing a heretic guilty, the ecclesiastical court would relax the prisoner to the secular arm. This was a legal fiction, meaning they would hand the condemned person over to the city authorities for the actual execution. It allowed the church to orchestrate the persecutions while maintaining the technicality of having clean hands. Historians still analyze the complex power dynamics and collaborations between church and state that made these mass persecutions possible. The reaction of the crowd to the verdict is one of catharsis. A great cheer goes up. They are not cheering for the death of their neighbors. They are cheering for what they believe is the salvation of their city. They believe they have witnessed a great victory in the war against evil. They have identified the enemy, rooted them out, and are about to excise them like a cancer. They feel a sense of relief. Those power have restored order for the first time in months. They feel like they are doing something that will actually work. You look at the faces of the condemned on the scaffold. Their expressions are ones of utter defeat, of a despair so deep it has gone beyond fear. They are not just facing their own deaths. They are facing a world that has gone completely mad, a world in which their innocence is irrelevant. They have been cast as the villains in the city's passion play, and their assigned role is to suffer and die so that the community can feel cleansed. The show trial is over. The legal niceties have been observed. The paperwork is all in order. The city has followed its own twisted rules to arrive at the verdict it wanted from the very beginning. The final act of this tragedy is all that remains. The public ritual of blame is about to transition into the public ritual of punishment. The sentence has been passed, and the final act begins. The punishment for heresy and witchcraft, the ultimate crimes against God and community, is almost universally death by fire. This method of execution was not chosen for its cruelty alone. It was steeped in a deep and powerful symbolism. Fire was seen as a purifying agent. By burning the bodies of the condemned, the community believed it was not just killing a criminal, but erasing their sin, cleansing the very air of their corrupting influence. A body buried in the earth might taint the soil, but a body reduced to ashes could do no more harm. It was a spiritual sterilization. The condemned are led from the scaffold and loaded onto the same cart that brought them to their trial. A grim procession forms. At the head are the city guards, followed by a priest holding a crucifix aloft. Then comes the cart, rattling over the cobblestones. Behind it, a vast crowd follows, a strange mix of pious churchgoers, curious onlookers, and grieving family members of plague victims seeking a final, bitter closure. The procession moves slowly through the city streets. A final tour of the world they are about to leave. This public shaming, known as the amende honorable, was a key part of the punishment. The condemned were forced to endure the taunts, the spittle, and the thrown refuse of the very people they were accused of harming. It was a final, brutal humiliation, designed to strip them of their last vestiges of dignity before their deaths. Their destination is a large, open field just outside the city walls. This is the traditional site for executions, a place tainted by its association with death and justice. In the center of the field, stakes have been driven into the ground, and around them are piled huge stacks of wooden kindling. It's a grim, business-like setup. The condemned are pulled from the carton tied to the stakes. Agnes, her face a blank mask of shock, is tied to the central post. The others are arranged around her. The priest approaches each one, holding up the crucifix and urging them to make a final confession, to repent their sins and save their souls, if not their bodies. Some may whisper a prayer, others may curse their executioners, but most are silent, lost in their own private terror. A strange but historically documented detail of some of these executions was the bag of mercy. Sometimes, a small bag of gunpowder would be tied around the neck of the condemned. It was not an official part of the sentence, but a semi-sanctioned act of pity by the executioner or a sympathetic guard. The idea was that when the flames reached the bag, it would explode, hastening death and sparing the victim some of the prolonged agony of being burned alive. The existence of this practice shows the strange, contradictory mix of extreme brutality and small, fleeting moments of humanity that characterize the age. Once the preparations are complete, the executioner, often a man who inherited the grim trade from his father, steps forward with a lit torch. The mayor or another high-ranking official gives a signal. The torch is applied to the kindling. At first, The fire is small, a crackly, smoky affair. Then, as it catches the dry wood, it roars to life. The crowd, which had been a murmuring mass, falls silent. All eyes are fixed on the pyre. This is the moment of purification. This is the city offering its sacrifice to an angry God. They believe that as the smoke rises to the heavens, it carries with it the filth of the sins that caused the plague. The scene is a sensory overload. The intense heat of the flames, the acrid smell of burning wood and something else, the roar of the fire, and the screams of the dying. It's a moment of supreme, terrifying catharsis for the onlookers. They are witnessing the physical destruction of the evil that has tormented them. They feel a sense of righteous power. They are no longer helpless victims of a mysterious disease. They are active agents of divine justice. Historians who study the psychology of crowds have often analyzed these public executions. They argue that these events served as a powerful social bonding mechanism. By collectively participating in this ritual of violence, the community reaffirmed its shared values and its collective identity. The enemy was destroyed. The boundary between us and them was indelibly drawn in fire, and the social order, which had been fractured by the plague, felt, for a moment, restored. As the flames die down and the smoke begins to clear, a somber mood settles over the crowd. The catharsis gives way to a grim sense of finality. They begin to disperse, heading back through the city gates to their homes. They are tired but filled with a renewed, fragile hope. They have done the terrible, necessary thing. They have cut out the cancer. They have purified their city. Now, they can only wait and pray that it was enough. They look to the sky, half expecting a sign, a signal that God is pleased and that the plague will finally relent. In the days and weeks that follow the executions, a strange and deceptive calm settles over the city. The pyre outside the walls is a blackened, smoldering scar on the landscape, a grim reminder of the city's purification. Inside the walls, the people wait, watching, listening, and counting. And then, a remarkable thing happens. The death rate begins to fall. The daily toll of the death carts, which had been a relentless, horrifying rhythm, starts to decrease. One day there are 20 bodies, the next 15, then 10. The constant, dreadful ringing of the funeral bells, which have since been allowed to resume, becomes less frequent. People start to emerge from their shuttered homes. Blinking in the sunlight, they see fewer fresh plague signs daubed on their neighbors' doors. For the people of the city, this is not a coincidence. It is proof. It is a direct, causal link. They performed the necessary ritual. They excised the evil from their midst, and now God has rewarded them by lifting his scourge. The friar's sermon was true. The city council's actions were justified. The forced confessions were the real truth. The executions were. The logic is simple, powerful, and, from their perspective, undeniable. We had a problem. We found the cause. We eliminated the cause. The problem went away. The narrative is complete. It's a story that makes sense of the senseless. A story of sin, punishment, repentance, and redemption. It validates everything they have done, washing away any lingering guilt or doubt in a tide of relief. Of course, from your 21st century perspective, you understand the real reason for the decline. The plague, like any epidemic, has a natural life cycle. The bacillus, Yersinia pestis, has burned through the most vulnerable parts of the population. The city's rat population, the primary host for the plague-carrying fleas, has been decimated. Many of the survivors have developed a degree of immunity. The arrival of warmer, drier weather might also have played a role, affecting the life cycle of the fleas. The decline was a matter of epidemiology, not theology. It would have happened with or without the witch hunt, with or without the fiery purification. This is one of the most tragic and insidious aspects of scapegoating. The perpetrators of the violence often receive what they perceive as confirmation of their actions. The rooster who believes his crowing makes the sun rise is the perfect metaphor. The city crows by burning innocent women, and the sun rises as the plague naturally recedes. The rooster and the city learned the wrong lesson. They learned that their horrific actions were not only justified but effective. This confirmation has long-lasting consequences. It solidifies the link between prostitution, witchcraft, and disease in the popular imagination. The story of how they cured the plague will be told and retold, becoming part of the city's folklore. It will serve as a precedent for future crises. The next time there is a famine, a drought, or another outbreak of disease, they will know who to blame and what to do. The scapegoating mechanism has been tested and proven successful. A specific, chilling detail that emerges from this is how the property of the condemned is handled. The city council, now vindicated, officially seizes the houses, land, and any meager possessions of Agnes and the others. This property is then sold off, with the proceeds going into the city's depleted coffers. The very people who orchestrated the purge now profit from it. This act of appropriation is a final, desecrating victory, erasing the victims not just from life, but from the economic and social ledger of the city. Historians still debate the extent to which this economic motive, rather than pure religious fervor, drove the persecutions. Was the purification of the city also a convenient land and asset grab? You watch as the city slowly, cautiously, comes back to life. The market square, once a place of fear and execution, gradually returns to being a place of commerce. Merchants reopen their stalls. The sounds of hammers and saws from the artisans' workshops begin to replace the silence of the plague days. People still eye each other with a degree of caution, but the wrought error has subsided, replaced by a deep, collective trauma and a fragile sense of hope. The conversation in the taverns is no longer about the daily death toll. It's about rebuilding, about the future. They talk about the heroes of the plague, the brave priests who stayed to tend to the sick, the city councilmen who boldly took action. They talk about the villains, the witches and their conspirators who brought this horror upon them. The narrative is being set in stone. The memory of the event is being curated, edited to fit the comforting story of good versus evil. The complex, messy reality of what happened is being smoothed over, simplified, and turned into a moral lesson. The plague may be ending, but the poison of the cure will linger in the city's soul for a very long time. The city breathes again. The air, which once seemed thick with miasma and fear, now feels clean and new. The plague has passed, leaving behind a landscape of profound loss and eerie silence. Entire families have been wiped out. Houses stand empty, their doors swinging in the wind. The workshops of the guilds are missing a third of their members. The city is a ghost of its former self, populated by the survivors. And in this new, emptier world, a strange and universal silence falls over the subject of the purge. No one talks about Agnes. No one mentions the pyre outside the walls. It's as if a collective amnesia has taken hold. The event that was, just weeks ago, the central drama of the city's existence, the very act they believed had saved them, is now a topic to be avoided, a memory to be buried. This silence is not born of guilt or remorse, not at first. It's born of a deep, instinctual need to move on. The trauma has been too great, the horror too immense, to dwell on the details, the accusations, the torture, the screams is to risk being pulled back into the madness. The survivors are focused on the practicalities of life, finding food, reopening businesses, caring for the newly orphaned. They don't have the emotional energy to look back. You see the silence in action. You might see the husband of one of the executed women in the market. People don't shun him, but they don't meet his eye. They give him a wide berth, a small zone of unspoken awkwardness surrounding him. His very presence is a reminder of something everyone wants to forget. What can they say to him? Sorry we burned your wife, based on a rumor and a forced confession. The social contract requires a quiet, mutual agreement to pretend it never happened. The children of the condemned face a particularly difficult fate. They are now orphans, but they are also the offspring of witches and poisoneresses. They carry the stain of their parents' alleged crimes. Some are taken in by relatives, who might change their names, then move to a different parish to escape the stigma. Others are left to fend for themselves, joining the growing ranks of vagrant children on the city streets. Their lives are a testament to the long shadow of the persecution. A fascinating and poignant historical parallel is the concept of dam adi omemoriae from ancient Rome, the damnation of memory. This was a formal decree by the Senate to erase a disgraced individual, usually a deposed emperor from history. Their statues would be torn down, their name chiseled off inscriptions, their laws rescinded. The purge in your city undergoes a similar, if unofficial, process. The names of the victims are struck from the public consciousness. The location of the execution becomes a place people hurry past, a piece of geography with a bad reputation, its specific history deliberately blurred. The authorities, who had been so vocal during the hunt, are now equally silent. The city council is busy with the administrative challenges of a post-plague world, reassessing property taxes, dealing with disputed inheritances for heirless estates, trying to get the guilds functioning again. They have no interest in revisiting the legal proceedings of the purge. The confessions are filed away in the archives, the trial record sealed. The truth they manufactured has served its purpose. Now it needs to be put away. Historians who study the aftermath of such events often debate the nature of this public silence. Is it a sign of collective guilt, a subconscious acknowledgement that something terrible and unjust was done? Or is it the opposite, a sign of collective certainty? Perhaps they are silent because, in their minds, the matter is settled. Justice was done. The problem was solved. And there is simply nothing more to say. The silence isn't about hiding a crime. It's about closing a chapter. But as the immediate trauma fades, a new, more pragmatic reason for the silence emerges. The city needs to rebuild. It needs to attract new workers to replace the dead. It needs to re-establish trade with other towns. A reputation as a city prone to violent, chaotic purges is bad for business. The same pragmatic logic that once led the city to tolerate the brothels now leads it to bury the memory of their destruction. The economic health of the city requires a clean slate and a short memory. So, the survivors go on. They marry, have children, and build new lives in the empty spaces left by the dead. The new generation will grow up knowing the great pestilence only through the stories of their elders. And those stories will be carefully edited. They will be tales of loss, of resilience, of God's mysterious ways. But the chapter about the witch hunt, about the women who were sacrificed to appease a terror that no one understood, will be missing. It will become a footnote, a whisper, a ghost in the city's official memory. The silence of the survivors is the final victory of the lie. As the city pulls itself from the ashes of the plague, it becomes clear that the purification has left behind more than just a legacy of silence. It has fundamentally and permanently altered the city's social and legal landscape. The relationship between the authorities and the city's sexual economy will never be the same again. Before the plague, the system of licensed, regulated brothels was a model of cynical pragmatism. It was based on the idea that prostitution was a necessary evil that needed to be contained and managed, not eradicated. But the plague shattered that logic. The women of the stews were no longer seen as a tool for maintaining social order, but as a potential source of catastrophic moral and physical contagion. You see the new reality take shape in the laws passed by the newly confident city council. The emergency decrees issued during the height of the panic, the ones that outlawed the trade and closed the stew houses, are not rescinded. They are made permanent. What was once a temporary public health measure becomes the new moral standard. The official policy shifts from regulation to suppression. Rose Lane is officially no more. The buildings that once housed the brothels are sold off and repurposed. One might become a granary. Another might be converted into tenements for weavers, families. The city is actively trying to erase the street's former identity, to gentrify its own memory. The goal is to create a new, more godly urban geography. This shift from regulation to suppression had a profound and, for the women involved, devastating effect. Under the old system, they were marginalized and exploited, but they existed within a legal framework. They had a recognized, if lowly, place. They paid taxes and, in return, received a minimal degree of protection from the law. They could, in theory, sue a client who assaulted them or refused to pay. No, they are true outlaws. With a trade-driven underground, they lose all legal protection. They are now operating in the shadows, entirely at the mercy of violent clients, abusive pimps, and corrupt city guards who can extort them at will. The reforms that were meant to purify the city had, in practice, made the lives of its most vulnerable women infinitely more dangerous. A small but significant legal change that occurs in many cities during this period is the criminalization of the client. In the old system, only the women and the keepers were regulated. The men who used their services were generally ignored by the law. But in the new, more moralistic climate, some cities began to pass laws punishing the men as well. These laws were often selectively enforced, targeting lower-class men while the wealthy and powerful continued to act with impunity. But their existence marks a significant ideological shift. The sin is no longer just in the selling, it's in the buying as well. The church, which had once been a willing and profitable landlord to the brothels, now becomes a zealous enforcer of the new morality. Priests preach fire and brimstone against any hint of the trade's return. They establish new charitable institutions, like the Magdalene houses, designed to rescue and reform fallen women. These institutions, while sometimes well-intentioned, were often little more than penitential workhouses, where the women were subjected to a harsh regime of prayer, labor, and discipline, their lives controlled by the very institution that had once profited from their sin. Historians trace a major turning point in European social policy to this post-plague era. The old, more tolerant model of the early Middle Ages gives way to what is sometimes called the Great Confinement of the early modern period. Across Europe, cities begin to take a much harsher line on all forms of social deviance, not just prostitution, but also vagrancy, begging, and public drunkenness. They build workhouses, poorhouses, and hospitals to confine and control these disorderly elements of the population. The plague had revealed the fragility of the social order, and the response was to build a more rigid, more punitive, and more controlling system. The debate among scholars is whether this was a direct result of the plague trauma or part of a longer-term trend that the plague simply accelerated. Was it the fear of disease that led to this new obsession with moral and social purity? Or were other factors, like the rise of new, more austere forms of religious thought and the consolidation of state power, the primary drivers? As with so many historical questions, the answer is not a simple either-or. The trauma of the Black Death acted as a powerful catalyst, hardening existing prejudices and providing a compelling justification for a new, more repressive social order. You walk down the street that was once Rose Lane. It's quieter now, more respectable. The bright lanterns are gone. The raucous laughter has been silenced. On the surface, the city has achieved its goal. It has been purified. But you know that the trade has not disappeared. It has just become invisible. It has moved into the back alleys, the taverns, the bathhouses, operating without rules, without protection, in a dark and dangerous new world. The system has been permanently changed. But the change has not brought salvation. It has only brought more suffering for those at the very bottom. Years have passed. The city has recovered. In a way, the population has slowly begun to grow again. The scars are still there, the empty houses, the gaps in family lineages, but a new generation is growing up for whom the great pestilence is a story, not a memory. And now, in the quiet libraries of monasteries and the halls of the newly founded universities, scholars are beginning to write the first histories of the plague. They are trying to make sense of what happened, to create a definitive record for posterity. And it is here, in these first attempts at history, that the debate truly begins. The first chroniclers, many of the monks who lived through the event, write with the certainty of true believers. Their accounts are filled with divine portents, moral lessons, and righteous fury. They describe the plague as God's judgment. They detail the sins of the people, and they record the discovery of the poisoner as conspiracy and the subsequent executions as a factual account of a great victory over evil. For them, there is no ambiguity. The women burned at the stake were witches. The Jews were conspirators, and their punishment was just unnecessary. This becomes the official version of the story, the one that is copied and passed down for generations. But even in this early period, there are dissenting voices, though they are often faint and cautious. A physician in a faraway city might write in a letter to a colleague that he finds the poisoning theory unlikely, suggesting that the disease seems to be a natural, if terrifying, phenomenon. A humanist scholar, rediscovering the works of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, might privately scoff at the superstitious tales of demons and witches, seeing them as a lapse into barbarism. These skeptical voices are a minority, and their views are not widely circulated, but they plant the first seeds of a different interpretation. Fast forward a few centuries to the Age of Enlightenment. Thinkers armed with the new tools of reason and scientific inquiry look back at the medieval plague accounts with a mixture of horror and disdain. They see the witch hunts not as a battle against evil, but as a shameful episode of superstition and religious fanaticism. For them, the story is a clear-cut case of an ignorant, priest-ridden society turning on the innocent out of fear. The women were victims, the clergy were villains, and the whole affair was a tragedy born of a lack of reason. This becomes the new dominant narrative, a story used to highlight the progress humanity has made from a dark age into an age of light. But in the modern era, professional historians, with access to a wider range of sources, court records, tax rolls, personal letters, archaeological evidence, begin to find that both the medieval and the Enlightenment narratives are too simple. They start to ask more nuanced questions, and this is where the real, ongoing debate lies. One of the central questions they grapple with is, was the persecution a top-down or a bottom-up phenomenon? The top-down argument suggests that the purges were orchestrated by the elites, the church leaders, the princes, the city councils. In this view, the common people were whipped into a frenzy by cynical leaders who used the scapegoats to deflect blame for their own inability to handle the crisis, to cancel debts, and to seize property. The proponents of this theory point to the legalistic, organized nature of the trials and the clear financial benefits for the authorities. The persecution was, in essence, an act of state-sanctioned terror. The bottom-up argument, on the other hand, posits that the violence erupted organically from the grassroots. It was the common people, driven to madness by terror and grief, who first identified the scapegoats. The popular pressure was so immense that the authorities had no choice but to go along with it, or risk being overthrown themselves. In this view, the trials and executions were not a cynical ploy, but a reluctant attempt by the elites to manage and channel a mob violence that they could not control. Proponents of this view point to instances where mobs attacked the accused before the authorities could even intervene. Of course, most historians today agree that the truth is a complex interplay of both. It was a deadly feedback loop, where popular panic was legitimized and amplified by the authorities, and the authorities' actions were in turn fueled by the pressure from below. But the debate over which factor was the primary driver, elite manipulation or popular hysteria, continues to be a central theme in the study of this period. Another major area of debate is the role of gender. Why were women, and specifically prostitutes, a primary target? Early historians often glossed over this, lumping them in with other outcasts. But feminist historians in the 20th and 21st centuries have placed this question at the center of their analysis. They argue that the persecution cannot be understood without understanding the deep-seated misogyny of medieval society. They point to a long tradition in Christian theology of viewing women as morally weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and more closely associated with the sins of the flesh. The plague, they argue, was not the cause of this misogyny, but the trigger that allowed it to explode into lethal violence. The witch was not just a random scapegoat. She was the physical embodiment of a male-dominated society's deepest anxieties about female power and sexuality. These are not just dry academic arguments. They are attempts to answer a fundamental question about human nature. How do societies behave under extreme pressure? The story of the plague and its scapegoats becomes a dark laboratory for studying the dynamics of fear, blame, and violence. There are no easy answers, and the historical evidence can often be read in multiple ways. And so, the debate continues. In books, in journals, in university classrooms, the scholars are still arguing about Agnes, about the friar, about the city council. They are still trying to understand why a city, in its desperation to heal itself, chose to commit such a terrible, self-inflicted wound. You pull yourself away from the academic debates and back to the streets of the city, now centuries removed from the great pestilence. The world has been utterly transformed. The timber-framed houses have given way to stone and brick. The narrow, muddy lanes have been paved and widened. The city walls have been torn down, no longer needed for defense and now an impediment to a growing metropolis. Yet, if you know where to look, the ghosts of that terrible time are still here. You stand in the modern-day city square. It's no longer a site for executions. It's a bustling plaza with cafes, shops, and tourists taking pictures. But it's the same piece of ground where the friar preached, where Agnes was condemned. You look at the grand facade of the town hall and know that somewhere in its archives, a brutal piece of parchment still exists, bearing the record of her forced confession. The Q in the notary's script for qua-style question, and the R for response, some response marking the dialogue of that horrific interrogation. The memory is not gone, just buried under layers of time and progress. You wander over to the area that was once Rose Lane. It's now a trendy, respectable street, perhaps home to art galleries or expensive apartments. There is no plaque on the wall, no monument to the women who lived and were hunted here. The city has chosen to remember its kings and its generals, its artists and its saints. It has not chosen to remember its outcasts. The forgetting is a form of final judgment. You reflect on the journey you've taken, from the first anxious whispers of a distant sickness to the ashes of the final pyre. You saw how a society's pre-existing fractures, its religious intolerance, its social hierarchies, its fear of female sexuality, did not cause the plague, but determined its response. The pestilence was a random biological event, but the persecution was a deeply human creation, a story that the city told itself to make sense of the chaos. It was a story about sin and punishment. At the beginning, the sin was collective. We are all sinners, and God is punishing us. But this was too abstract, too unsatisfying, so the story evolved. The sin was localized onto a specific group. Their sin is greater than ours. They are the cause of our suffering. This was more comforting because it created a clear us and them. Then, the story became more specific still. It became a conspiracy. They are not just sinning. They are actively working to destroy us with poison. This was the most powerful version of the story because it transformed the city from a collection of helpless victims into a band of righteous warriors fighting a tangible enemy. It gave them agency. It gave them a target for their rage and fear. You saw how this story was built, piece by piece. It was built from the pulpit of a charismatic preacher, in the torture chamber of a desperate legal system, and in the hearts of a terrified populace. And you saw how, through a tragic accident of epidemiology, the story received its happy ending when the plague receded, proving that the narrative was true all along. You think about the concept of memory. The city chose to remember its victory over the poison arrests, but to forget the names and faces of the victims. It remembered the sin, but forgot the sinner who was innocent. This selective memory is not unique to this time or place. It is a fundamental human coping mechanism. We build narratives to survive trauma, and those narratives often require heroes and villains, even if we have to invent them. The great, unresolved question that hangs over this entire history is one of moral culpability. Who was truly to blame? Was it the fiery preacher, the pragmatic mayor, the torturer in the dungeon, the neighbor who pointed an accusing finger? Or was the blame so diffuse, spread across an entire society caught in a collective psychosis, that no single individual can be held responsible? It is a question that has no easy answer, and it's the question that keeps the story relevant. As you stand on a modern bridge, looking down at the river that once brought the plague to the city's gates, you realize that the story is not just about a distant, dark past. It is a timeless parable about how fear can deform a community, how in our desperate search for answers, we can create monstrous certainties, and how the line between victim and perpetrator can become terrifyingly blurred. The city survived the plague, but it did so at the cost of its own soul, a cost recorded in the silent, unmarked graves of the women It chose to sacrifice. The final destination on your journey is not a place, but a document. You find it deep within a university library, a place of quiet reverence for the past. It's a small, unassuming book, a later edition of a Dance of Death woodcut series, a popular artistic genre that emerged in the wake of the plague. The book is filled with images of skeletons leading people from all walks of life: kings, bishops, merchants, peasants in a final, grim dance. The message is simple. Death comes for everyone, regardless of status. But as you turn the pages, you notice something. There's a depiction of the Pope, the Emperor, the Knight, the Farmer. There's even a depiction of a moneylender, often drawn with stereotypical Jewish features. But there is no image of a prostitute. In the great, egalitarian democracy of death, she is not even granted a place in the procession. She has been edited out, deemed too lowly, too marginal, too sinful to even be included in the universal fate of humanity. This small, artistic omission is, in its own way, the most profound statement of all. It represents the final stage of the process, the erasure of the victims from the cultural memory. They were not just killed, they were rendered invisible, their stories absorbed into the larger, more convenient narrative of witchcraft and diabolical conspiracy, and then ultimately discarded as insignificant. Their story becomes a footnote, a niche topic for academic debate, a curiosity for a late-night storyteller like me to uncover. The grand histories of the Black Death will focus on the macro level, the demographic collapse, the economic consequences, the decline of feudalism, the rise of nation-states. These are the important, world-changing results of the play. The fate of a few hundred or a few thousand marginalized women across Europe is a rounding error in the grand scheme of history. And yet, their story is the one that tells us the most about the human experience of the plague. It's a story about how we react when our world is turned upside down, when the systems we rely on, medicine, government, religion, fail us. It shows our desperate need for a narrative, for a story that makes sense of the senseless. And it reveals our terrible capacity to inflict suffering on the most vulnerable among us in the name of that story. The historical debate over whether the persecution was primarily driven by religious fanaticism, economic opportunism, or pure social panic will never be fully resolved. The truth, as always, is a messy and uncomfortable combination of all three. The friar who preached hatred likely believed he was doing God's work. The mayor who signed the death warrants likely believed he was restoring order. The citizen who threw a stone likely believed he was protecting his family. They were all characters in a tragedy of their own making, trapped by the limitations of their own worldview. You close the book gently. The story of these women is not a grand tale of kings and battles. It's a small, dark, and deeply human story. It's a whisper from the past, a cautionary tale about the dangers of certainty in a time of fear. It reminds us that the first casualty of a crisis is often not the truth itself, but our willingness to tolerate ambiguity, and that the search for a simple villain often leads us to create one where none exists. Their final, tragic legacy is to serve as a perpetual reminder, a reminder that societies are fragile ecosystems, and that fear is a more potent poison than any disease. A reminder that the line between a necessary evil and a sacrificial lamb is perilously thin, and a reminder that the voices of the most marginalized are often the first to be silenced and the last to be heard. They remain a silent, haunting note in the grand, chaotic symphony of the past, a testament to the fact that the worst monsters are often the ones we create ourselves.